Oh, okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second meeting this year of the English Department Speaker Series. The second meeting this year, but very excitingly, the first meeting with a local presenter. So I'm Professor Megan Heffernan. I chair this committee, and I wanted to thank Dan Stolar and Bill Johnson Gonzalez for help running this. And we're just delighted to have you all here in this I'm quite full Zoom room to welcome Dr. Sarah Fay to talk about her new book, which is just about to be out. And we got the poster over her shoulder there. And I'm going to, here's the order of events. I will turn things over to Dan Stolar, who will introduce Sarah. Sarah will read for a bit, and then she's going to help marshal a conversation about the reading and especially about mental health. So without further ado, I will mute myself and pass the mic off.
Hi all, it's really nice to see so many people for a change, and really feel lucky to have Sarah Fay, our own person, our own professor here to present from her new book, which some of us probably read parts of when they first appeared a couple of years ago. Is that right, Sarah? And so it's exciting to see it in book form and getting all of the great attention that it's getting now, which is great. Dr. Sarah Fay is an author and activist. Her memoir, Pathological, A True Story of 6 Misdiagnoses, which comes out March 15th, is a fascinating mix of memoir and journalistic expose of the DSM. Perfectly timed for the release of the updated version, also in March. Her writing appears in many publications, a long list, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Time Magazine, The New Republic, McSweeney's, The Believer, and the Paris Review. She's a recipient of the Hopwood Award for Literature, as well as grants and fellowships from Yaddo, the Mellon Foundation, and the MacDowell Colony. She's currently on faculty at DePaul, as well as Northwestern, and she's the founder of Pathological, the movement, a public awareness campaign devoted to making people aware of the unreliability and invalidity of DSM diagnoses and the dangers of identifying with an unproven mental illness. So without much more ado, I will hand the thing over to Sarah Fay.
Thank you so much, and all of you, claps, for being here and just being open to embarking on this conversation. I wrote Pathological to try to improve the mental health system that I was in and still am in, but I started at age 12. And so the book I wrote is full of information that I didn't know when I was going through everything that I went through. And so it has a lot of new information in it that a lot of people haven't heard yet. And maybe people haven't even heard of the DSM, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the book from which all of our mental health diagnoses come. And there's a lot of backstory to that book. And my book is very much an expose, as Dan said, of it, but it's really an investigation into it. So I'm not anti-psychiatry. I see a psychiatrist. I respect my psychiatrist greatly. I'm not anti-medication. I take medication. But what I found is that DSM diagnoses aren't scientifically valid and are largely unreliable. So I'll talk a bit about that afterward. I also just wanted to preface my reading by saying that although DSM diagnoses are very, very flawed, mental illness is very, very real. And I identify with having had or have one. We don't know that any diagnosis or any mental illness is chronic. There's no evidence to suggest that. So for now, the jury's out, and I don't know what that means for me, but I have no shame and actually take quite a bit of pride in having had or having a mental illness, and feel that I'm in a group of very, very strong people who've been through a lot. And even if people don't see us that way, we are. So I want to offer that to everyone. Okay, so I'm going to read the prologue, and then I hope that I can answer any questions that you have, either about the book, writing the book. I know there are a lot of creative writers here, or about the content of it and talking about mental health. And that doesn't necessarily mean talking about your personal diagnosis. That's sort of what's happened in our culture, is that when we talk about mental health, we talk about diagnoses and personal diagnoses. But I think what we can do instead is really educate and talk about the DSM and some of those things. So great. All right. So this is the prologue. The slower we walk, the more I seem to sweat. Summer, Chicago, the two of us wandering the streets around Northwestern Memorial Hospital, looking for the inpatient psychiatry unit where Dr. H said I could find help. I'd left him a message. He hadn't called back. The building seemed dislocated and distant. Doctors and nurses in scrubs passed us on the sidewalk. Their voices cracked against my chest. A cab honked. A truck started up, billowing exhaust. I heard the strain in your voice when you asked why the psychiatric unit wasn't where Dr. H said it would be. Worry weighed down the skin of your barely aging face. People said you looked 50, though you were in your 70s. The families, people say, the families go through hell. I'll never know what it was like for all of you. So much of that time I spent alone, trying to understand the 6 diagnoses I thought were real. This isn't a classic mental illness memoir. That kind of memoir is a quest story. From the beginning, our hero is exceptional. She's a debutante or a celebrity or a genius, or at the very least, she attends an Ivy League school when her enviable potential is dashed by mental illness. Her journey is extreme. She must leave the ordinary world in search of the elixir that will ultimately cure her. Trials hinder her attempts to find it. She's committed to a psychiatric facility, or she becomes a professional mental patient, a victim of the psychiatric industrial complex. Of course, she triumphs, ending up in the light, elixir in hand, accepting medication or getting off medication, finding true love or God, discovering her illness was physical, thank goodness, not mental after all, devoting herself to meditation or some other supposedly natural remedy, or finding a brilliant physician or free-thinking therapist who saves her. On the book's final pages, she's no longer ill or has embraced her illness. She's rejected her diagnosis or accepted it. My path wasn't that clear. I went to a good university and may or may not have shown promise. I wasn't a professional mental patient. I wasn't a victim. Doctors didn't find a physical cause. Many elixirs were tried: food, alcohol, exercise, various therapies, natural remedies, and finally, psychotropic drugs. The result was pain, monotony, confusion, and messiness. Yes, I was told with certainty, one after another, I had anorexia, major depressive disorder, MDD, anxiety disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, bipolar disorder. Yes, I almost died. But I was a willing participant. No one brainwashed me. I believed in and accepted those 6 diagnoses, adopted them, thought in terms of them, identified myself as them, medicalizing my difficulties and discomforts, pathologizing my emotions and thoughts and behaviors. Embracing a diagnosis can be a good thing. It can increase the likelihood that a person will get help. It can lead someone to find a community of people who suffer from the same diagnosis. It can empower a person. But it led me into a spiral. Each diagnosis was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The sicker I believed myself to be, the more evidence I found confirming I was sick. The more evidence I had, the more certain I became. The more certain I became, the more willing I was to undergo treatments. The more treatments I underwent, the sicker I believed myself to be. It's too easy to lay blame, but I do. I blame a book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. How can I blame pages, words, letters, dots, dashes, lines, marks on paper? Because the DSM is powerful. Jeffrey Lieberman, former president of the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, called it, quote, the most influential book written in the past century. Sociologist Alan Horowitz, author of DSM, A History of Psychiatry's Bible, writes that it controls the diagnoses we receive and how we think about them, which might be fine if the DSM had scientific merit, which it doesn't. Some of the most prominent psychiatrists have referred to DSM diagnoses as constructs and placeholders. Others have admitted that they have no reality, pathologize normality, or are made up. As former National Institute of Mental Health Director Thomas Insel put it, we, quote, actually believe diagnoses are real, but there's no reality. Alan Francis, one-time chair of the DSM-4 task force, is quoted as saying that DSM diagnoses confuse, quote, mental disorder with the everyday sadness, anxiety, grief, disappointments, and stress responses that are an inescapable part of the human condition. Stephen Hyman, another former NIMH director, called DSM diagnoses fictive categories, and the DSM an absolute scientific nightmare. But I didn't know DSM diagnoses were invented and had no validity and little reliability until it was almost too late. Validity, which is considered the most fundamental principle in medicine, would mean that DSM diagnoses can be objectively measured, which they can't. Reliability assumes that multiple clinicians presented with the same patient can rely on the symptoms listed in the DSM and will consistently agree on the patient's diagnosis, which they can't. It's tempting to fault the DSM's authors, those members of the APA who wielded those words and punctuation marks. How else did so many unproven diagnoses end up on the most recent edition's many, many, many pages? Over the editions, the number of diagnoses and spectrums and subtypes has grown and grown. The DSM-5 clocks in at 947 pages with 541 diagnostic categories, compared to the scant 132 pages and 128 categories in the DSM-1. The DSM's authors might defend themselves by saying they just want to make sure those who need care receive a diagnosis, even if they leave this part out. DSM diagnoses are speculative at best. It's also tempting to reproach psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, those who level DSM diagnoses, even though they know those diagnoses are unproven. They claim they have to label a patient with a diagnostic code to satisfy the insurance company and to get paid, even if they leave this part out. It means letting a patient believe she suffers from a diagnosis that's essentially theoretical. And pharmaceutical companies who've benefited from the DSM's revisions, and the academic psychiatrists and researchers who have profited from and built their careers on pathologizing normal distress. But the words, so convincing, do the most damage. They've taken on a life of their own. The DSM has become, as some say, a work of culture. It's socially sanctioned. Many, many people believe it's a scientifically proven medical manual. It's not even close. I could be the poster child for the dangers of the DSM. I lived through its most significant editions, the DSM's 3, 3R, 4, 4TR, 5, 5TR, and received 6 of its many, many diagnoses. I call them misdiagnoses because all DSM diagnoses are misdiagnoses. That is, incorrect, inaccurate, inadequate. They were created by loosening criteria, adding specifiers, shifting symptoms, broadening definitions, and lowering thresholds. How could I have so willingly accepted all those diagnoses and taken all those medications? Why did I believe the words that came from the DSM? I asked so few questions, lived with such little awareness. How could I have strayed so far and been so naive? Like so many who've been diagnosed, I wanted an explanation for what was happening to me, inside me, and no one had warned me about the DSM. Pathological is everything I wish I'd known. It's an attempt to help others understand the truth about the DSM diagnoses they or their loved ones receive. All those years, I wasn't the only one being diagnosed. There were the students I taught with autism and oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, in the New York City public schools. Shubi, a young man with schizophrenia, found not guilty by reason of insanity for murder, and the many, many college students who came to my office hours and spoke so unquestioningly about their anxiety disorder or depression or, quote, ADHD brains. I should explain my preoccupation with punctuation. Punctuation features in the book. To many people, punctuation is a tedious part of human existence. But I've spent my life writing and reading and teaching people how to write and read. Punctuation is the basis for communication. It's how we form thoughts. It's the mechanism behind our digital and written interactions, the vehicle that drives our connections and disconnections. Punctuation, like pathology, orders and categorizes. It tries to make sense of what's otherwise disordered. When I refer to punctuation, I don't mean to privilege standard English. Every language and combination of languages and subtype of a language has its own rules. Spanglish, African American vernacular English, etc. Standard English just happens to be my language. Punctuation clarifies. The ancient Greeks put no spaces between words. Their ink-laden papyri were a jumble of letters the reader had to decipher, all in one block. In the 3rd century BCE, the Greek librarian Aristophanes of Byzantium tried to mediate the madness. He used 3 dots to separate phrases. Each dot had a position on the line. A dot in the middle of a line, the comma, indicated a short pause. The one at the bottom, the colon, a medium pause. The one at the top, the periodos, a full stop. So many moments in this story call for a full stop. Like the day when my mother and I, never finding the psychiatric unit, entered the emergency room. Half full at midday, it lacked urgency. A man rested his elbows on his knees, a plastic bucket at his feet, as if waiting for him to vomit. 2 children climbed on the seats as a woman called to them to get down. In the cold of the air conditioning, we waited for my name to be called. A terrible energy surged through me. Overhead, the fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in time with it. I was on my 6th diagnosis, bipolar disorder. Already, I'd started to become bipolar. Each emotion, every thought, all my behaviors were signs and symptoms of my mental illness. A low mood meant depression. Chaotic thoughts and speaking quickly indicated mania. My name was called. The intake nurse took my blood pressure, normal, and listened to my heart, normal. She had chubby cheeks and a serious but kind demeanor. My temperature was normal too. I had no physical aches or pains. After I told her about the darkness and the racing thoughts and the suicidality, she shifted in her chair and looked at me. Her eyes were tired, exhausted. She said she could admit me to be examined by a psychiatrist. And then what? I asked. She sighed. You might be transferred to the psychiatric ward here or at another hospital. She paused, but you don't want that. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time and patience. I so appreciate it. So I'd love to open up for questions if anyone has them, either about what I read or the process of it. I'm in the throes of publicity, not throes in a bad way. I'm doing publicity right now. And so we can talk about that too. Yeah, Miles, thank you, my buddy.
Hey, Sarah. So we got a couple of students from my, I see you, Eddie and Sarah, by the way, from my English 101 class, Literature of Lies. And, you know, I was really interested in your description of the DSM diagnoses as constructs with no reality and fictive categories, sort of fit into our discussion in class today. I thought I might just read a quote from an author we read in class today. Truth is a story we tell, a history we accept, an agreement we make, a conversation, a negotiation. And I guess I'm just asking, where do the DSM diagnoses fit into that scale? And are they completely useless, or are they completely fictive, or is it a story we need to tell to understand ourselves? Thanks.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I do not want to throw the DSM out the window. It's what we have. It's what we get to use for now. And what I'm pushing for is to have this conversation and to educate people about the diagnoses they're receiving. So they are, according to experts, this isn't me because I'm not a mental health professional, but fictive diagnostic categories. And I trust Stephen Hyman and Thomas Insel and Alan Francis. These are, preeminent psychiatric researchers and psychiatrists and academics. And so I think where the DSM falls in, and I was just writing about this morning for an op-ed, there's something called informed consent. And we all, every time you see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or any mental health professional or any doctor, you sign a consent form. And if you're like me, you skim it and just think it's all fine, or it's a good thing, or it's pro forma. But on the clinician side, what it says is that the clinician agrees to be fully transparent. And so what I'm arguing for is actually informed consent. And that's that your mental health professional or a social worker or whoever it is that says to you, you have this diagnosis. They also say, oh, and by the way, these diagnoses are not proven. We have no way to prove you actually have it. And to give you the backstory, or your loved ones or whoever it is, so that we can take them not as necessarily these definitive diagnoses, but theories, possibilities, constructs that might be helpful, but also might not be helpful. The other thing I argue for is exit strategies, which means that there is no proof, as I said, that any DSM diagnosis is chronic, or that even mental illness, the most serious mental illnesses, SMIs, are chronic. And so an exit strategy would be, when you get a diagnosis, you meet with your mental health professional, says to you, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is the treatment I suggest. And when your symptoms abate, not if, but when they do, here's our exit strategy. Here's how we're going to look at how often you should come in for treatment, to see me or therapy. And here's what we might do with medication, if you're on medication or not, or meditation, or whatever treatment you have. So, I'm not trying to say that they're completely useless or not, but I knew none of this. I knew nothing about what I just read. And if I'd known, I may have done everything the same way that I did. I don't know. Because as I said, I believe I have a mental illness. And I mean, I couldn't live independently for 5 years. I was very, very ill. And there's no question about that. And I've been with people who unquestionably have mental illness. And so, but the DSM diagnoses, especially those that are being given out to people without serious mental illness, but, sort of, it's what we often people say, I feel that I have a problem that's interfering with my life. The problem with DSM diagnoses is there's no level of dysfunction. So there's no marker where we can say, yes, that's dysfunctional, or no, that depression isn't dysfunctional. So it's all based on self-reported symptoms and a clinician's opinion. So we just have to keep all that in mind, especially when we're diagnosing a 3-year-old with depression, or a 5-year-old with bipolar disorder. Or like me, I was 12 when I received my first diagnosis, and then I really saw the world and myself and my emotions and my thoughts through a lens of diagnosis. And if I can get us to a place where we're just thinking a little bit more about the diagnoses we're given, and mental health professionals feel the pressure to be transparent, that's what I hope for. I can't change the DSM, and I don't know what the solution is. Other, psychiatrists have some suggestions, but, and I think maybe lessening so we don't have 541 ways to be diagnosed with a mental disorder might be a place to start. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
It looks like there's a question in the chat. Do you want to read that?
Yeah, cool. So then, are you content without a definite label for your mental illness? How do you explain it to others without a label? Thank you for asking that question. It's a strange place to be, because I do see a psychiatrist. He has changed my diagnosis 3 times. I don't know what it is. I saw him 2 weeks ago. We were talking about the book, and I said, "Don't tell me what's on there," because again, it just wasn't helpful for me. Because the symptoms, as I said, I started to see the symptoms in myself. I have the luxury of refusing a diagnosis. I've been through a lot. I didn't find it helpful. I know they aren't helpful for me, and I respect those who find solace in a diagnosis, or find that they're valuable and think that that's as legitimate or valid a way to go as, the way that I did. How do I explain it to others? I think I'm very comfortable talking about mental illness and serious mental illness, because I feel that what's happened as we've made this push to try to destigmatize mental illness is that we've actually made them slightly trendy. Certain diagnoses are socially acceptable and others are not. And what's happened is those with serious mental illness, so that being schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar 1, those are the ones that it's not acceptable. And they're the ones who end up, 41% of our prison population has a serious mental illness. And nearly half of our homeless or people in transition population have a serious mental illness. So there's this real have or have nots that are happening. And so I feel very much like I'm trying to draw attention to those with mental illness, and especially serious mental illness. Not that all human suffering isn't real and deserve treatment, but yeah. So I feel like I'm trying to, in terms of my life though, I've never been happier, and I'll use that word actually, and I've never felt more stable or more grounded in just being in that kind of ambiguity of, I have a mental illness. And so that means I live a certain way. It's very tidy in here. I mean, I don't drink alcohol. I don't do drugs. I go to sleep at the same time every night. I wake up at the same time every morning. I don't travel very much. I mean, I live what I feel is a wonderful life, but I don't pretend that I could like go partying every weekend and maintain my emotional or mental stability. It just wouldn't happen. So. Yeah, Kate.
Hi. First of all, I actually relate to the experience of multiple misdiagnoses and how weird that is. So my question for you is, as an educator, how do you tend to handle conversations with students who might utilize or deal with diagnoses as they navigate like the structures of their education?
Yeah, I was very much ashamed of all of my diagnoses. I never spoke about them, and then I wrote this book, so now it's like they're everywhere. But so at the time when students did come to me, and I think that other professors that are here have probably had the same experience, I never really said anything except directed them to the Center for Students with Disabilities. And I feel even less, not qualified, but less comfortable with saying anything now because I've expressed such a strong opinion in my book. I will say that I've had students of mine read the book, and like you, Kate, so many of them have had similar experiences and been really moved by the book. Some of my students haven't been able to finish the book because it hit too close to home, and which I think is a great reaction to the book, actually, because that's someone who's very mentally healthy and taking care of themselves. But so I think I would say that for students, just knowing that there's some flexibility in this diagnosis that you've been given is a kind of light at the end of the tunnel that I did not have. I was speaking with my mom the other day, and she was talking about when I had anorexia, that she would, when I was diagnosed with that the doctors were just telling her she's going to die. Your daughter's going to die, over and over. And I thought, how did you survive that? But knowing that they're not chronic and that there is hope, I think is the best way to handle it. I hope that answers your question, Kate. Did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, I bet that you do have a lot of people who, find a huge measure of relief in this, and that's great. And it must be great to feel like you're really doing that valuable service. Have you had people who pushed back against it? Have you had psychiatrists and different, I don't know, pharmaceutical representatives maybe pushing back against your book at all?
No, I mean, well, yes and no. Some I find that people that are newly diagnosed, and again, this is a huge generalization, but who have identified themselves to me as newly diagnosed have pushed back, which I completely understand. When I received my diagnoses, I sort of clutched to them because I wanted them to provide answers for my suffering. And so I do understand that. Psychiatrists, sadly, have all said, we know, which to me is even worse than them pushing back, because they've known this whole time and they aren't saying anything and they aren't being honest with their patients. And so, so that's been the response from psychiatry. I haven't heard from pharmaceutical companies, but I'm absolutely rely on my medication and need it and appreciate it. I'm very lucky in that I have very few side effects and it works for me. So I think pharma probably will want to sponsor me or something. I don't know. But yeah, so I mean, when the DSM, you mentioned the DSM-5, the newest revision, the DSM-5 TR comes out in March, the same month as my book. And the APA has been very, very quiet about it. They didn't announce it until about 2 weeks ago, and partly because when the DSM-5 came out in 2013, the uproar was tremendous. And so the APA likely doesn't want to resurrect that backlash. And what they've done is basically not changed very much. They've added a diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder, but that's it. And I wrote an op-ed about this, that to me, that's worse than changing a lot, because they've had nearly a decade to rectify the mistakes of the past, and they haven't. So I do think that there will be more conversation about it once people learn. I mean, I contacted eminent psychiatrists to ask if they knew that the new revision was coming out, and none of them knew. So it's been very under wraps. So I think some of that will probably happen more. But I'm surprised. I find more that people really identify with my experience and either know or love or have, relationships or are the parents of children who are going through this. And so really just want to talk about it. And that's what I wanted to do here. I want to have that conversation. Hey, Max. So Max says, how can we incentivize mental health professionals to make a shift to taking more meticulous and comprehensive looks at their patients that don't rely on encompassing labels, especially when they're often so underpaid? Thank you, Max. That's great. Yeah, and I should say my psychiatrist, and again, this is my privilege and I have a lot of it, he does not take insurance. And we were talking about that. And that's one reason why he can be very transparent with me, because he doesn't need to wrangle with insurance companies. And so again, that's a real gift to be able to, he can be transparent with his patients, and he is to a fault. But in terms of that, I was on a podcast called The Radical Therapist, and he actually is a therapist who has a practice where they do not use diagnoses. They will on the back end, but they will not tell patients the diagnosis, kind of like what I'm doing now. And so, if on the back end, they'll do it if they need medication. And so one thing too, I was thinking about today and just before this is just that when mental health in America, I mean, it's a fascinating history. And I recommend a book by Alan Horowitz called DSM, A History of Psychiatry's Bible. It's very thin. It's out from Johns Hopkins Press. And he writes very well for a general audience, but it goes through the whole history of sort of psychiatry in America. And when we, initially, all diagnoses were meant for doctors, for physicians to be able to communicate with each other. It was just a shorthand. That's all it was. And even through the DSM-4, that's all it was a shorthand. Patients were never meant to know their diagnosis, and certainly not to identify with it, and certainly not to post about it on social media or to have TikTok therapists diagnosing them on social media. None of that was part of the DSM plan. Now, the APA has made a lot of money off the DSM, so it behooves them to have more people talking about DSM diagnoses and even asking for DSM diagnoses and people buying the DSM and interested in the DSM. But, you know, this is all just to say that if we could get it back to the place where it's actually just among mental health professionals is a thought. But I don't know, Max. Do you have an idea, Max? You can answer. I wish, he said. So Francesca. I love the way that you connect punctuation to your discussion of order in your introduction. Can you say a little more about how you explore punctuation stylistically in your memoir? And congrats, thank you. Yeah, so I'm obsessed with punctuation. It started when I was in high school, and with my first diagnosis, I failed my 10th grade term paper. Yes, and then went on to write for the New York Times. Anyone can do it, I'm telling you. But one thing that happened, and it was my beloved English teacher, I admired him so much, and he was the first wheelchair user I ever knew. We were not friends. Did not have a closeness, but I just idolized him, and he was brilliant and taught us Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, and Crime and Punishment, and these books that just were so juicy and exciting to me. In my own way. And I was very, very ill when I took his class. And so when I failed my 10th grade term paper, he brought me into his office and went through all the problems, and there was a big F on it. And he said, and you use commas like you're decorating a Christmas tree. And I did. I would just sort of improvise, like, this looks good, and maybe I'll put one there. So from that time on, I really immersed myself in punctuation. It was so humiliating when he didn't mean to humiliate me, or maybe he did, I don't know. But, you know, I think he meant to wake me up, and he did. And so then, I mean, I've worked in so many different capacities as a teacher. I was a writer in residence in the New York City public schools in very marginalized communities. I was an ESL teacher. I was a writing tutor. I mean, so I had to know punctuation. And I think I sought those jobs out for that reason. And most of the time, I didn't know what I was talking about. I mean, even when I was a writing tutor, it was shaky, I've got to say. And so, but over the years, I became more and more fascinated with it and more in love with how I mean, I don't know, other writers in the room get a little bit just like excited when you really know, no, that's a dash, that's parenthetical dashes, not parentheses. Like, I know which ones to use, and it just expresses so much. So in the book, every chapter has the history of a punctuation mark. And so there are 14 chapters and 14 punctuation marks. And it goes through the history of them, but also how my thinking was at the time. So for instance, how I was making, when I had anorexia or was diagnosed with anorexia, I was making connections that weren't logical using comma and, you know, so that I was making these associations. Like, if the toast touches my lips, I'll gain 10 pounds. You know, that my mind was so disordered and that I was connecting things in the wrong way. So each one has its own punctuation mark. And when my agent picked up the book, she said she loved it, and a lot of people didn't. There were a lot of people who thought this will never fly, but she loved it because she said it's such a it's such an intense experience, and it's, you know, it's a memoir like many memoirs, and very intense. And she said it just gives you breathing room. It's like, you know, that it's coming up, so that it's just a little bit of a breather in there. Yeah, Kara.
So like the memoir seems to, you know, there's this, you know, obvious kind of message of, you know, like the Foucauldian kind of effect of discourse around mental illness, kind of growing it and mushrooming it into like what we have today. How, I'm wondering, like, if, you know, what your thoughts are, like, with all of your research that you've done, like, how do we decrease the conversation to kind of like, you know, stop this from continuing to balloon?
I'm hoping Pathological helps. I'm hoping that this does, start that conversation, and really the book gets out there, not for sales purposes, but to really just, as I said, change the mental health system, change the mental health conversation. In terms of calming it down, I think that the neuromythology around DSM diagnoses, so the idea that they're caused by a chemical imbalance or that they're biological or genetic in any way is not proven at all, not for schizophrenia even, which is sort of the favorite go-to for that explanation. And I believe they were from a chemical imbalance 100%. When my publicist believed they were from a chemical imbalance as of September. So it's in, so being a very, you can go on the internet very easily and be reaffirmed, that, oh, these are biological and they're chronic and they're from a chemical imbalance. And this is what I have, and explains my depression and my distractibility and all this humanness of me in some ways, not that that can't, tip over into disability or progress toward that. But I think that what I'm hoping is that this will get to mental health professionals and it will start there. My psychiatrist, I met with him, as I said, and we were talking about the book, and he said, this needs to be required reading for residents. So I told my publisher, and we're really going to try to get it into as many medical schools as we can, so that residents are just aware of what is it like to be on the other side of the DSM. And so I'm hoping that it can, because those are the people in power. And I started Pathological, the movement, which is a public awareness campaign to try to get the information that DSM diagnoses are not scientifically valid or reliable out there, so that people, again, can kind of just pause before accepting too strongly. I think that it can be, like I said, I need a diagnosis on paper to have medication, and that's real. So I'm not saying, again, like Miles was asking, I don't think that they're useless, but I really identified with them. I became them, as I said. I was the most depressed person, and then I was the most anxious person, and then I was the most bipolar person. I think that all of them, the symptoms were real. It wasn't, and I think that everyone, is experiencing something. No one's faking this. Yeah. Michelle? Oh, wait, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you so much for that great reading. I really love that opening of the book, and I'm enjoying reading it so much. I wanted to ask, because there are so many creative writers here, I wanted to ask about the writing process. To my mind, you wrote this in lightning speed, very quickly. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about that. And also, tangentially, I wondered if you wanted to comment on the common perception of writing as therapeutic, creative writing as therapeutic.
So I wrote it in 5 months. It was incredible how fast, and it just came out. It started as a collection of essays, and then, I was in conversation with one agent, and she said they just don't sell, and then it was going to be about eating disorders, and so it shifted a little bit. But once it found its way, and Michelle, I have to thank, she's in the acknowledgements. Michelle would just stand. I wrote a lot of it in my office at DePaul, and Michelle would just stand in my office, and I'd say something, and she'd say, "Just finish it, just finish it." That was all. It was all I needed. So I wrote it very quickly, and it got picked up very quickly. And I had, my dream came true on a dismal March day during the pandemic, where we thought it was going to be a month tops. And I'd always dreamed, even when I was in my 20s and I didn't have a book, that an agent would love my book so much that they would call halfway through and say, "Don't get representation from anyone else. I love your book." And on that March day, I got an email from my agent, and she said, "I'm 2/3 of the way through your book. I love it. Don't talk to anybody else." And it was like, wow, it just came true. So we sold it within about 6 weeks during the pandemic, which was amazing. Which is not to say a lot of publishers didn't pass for all the creative writers in here, because that did happen. Many people, it wasn't the book it is when we sold it. So I should say that too. And I think a lot of writers here know how much changes when you're in those, final months of publication. I have the best editor, and she is very hands off. And all she did is come in and she found the 3 things that the book needed, and she was 100% right. And it just like the book came together. So, but I wouldn't have been able to do it without her. So yeah, the book happened very, very quickly. In terms of the therapeutic, I think I wrote it so quickly that I didn't find that. I've never done the kind of writing as therapy thing. But what publicity has been very therapeutic in the sense that, and I was talking to the marketer yesterday, and she said that the problem they have is that writers write something and they're really excited about it. And often it's a memoir and it's very, divulges a lot, and it gets closer and closer to pub date and they just pull back. And suddenly they're a little bit wary of it. And she said, you just have to, it won't get out there and it won't reach readers if you don't stand behind it 100%. And she said, and she was saying, you stand behind it 100%. And I had to. And so that has been really amazing. And it's made me accept all parts of myself and get rid of any lingering shame is gone. And I just feel more like I'm just serving something and trying to improve the mental health system. And that's really all, I'm pretty tireless in publicity right now because of that. I don't feel like I'm selling books. I feel like I'm making a difference. And it's a wonderful mode to be in. Yeah, hope that answers. Okay, so do you have any thoughts on the way academic institutions often seem to be structured around the abilities of students or faculty to perform in a very uniform, very neurotypical manner, and how administration-based accommodations seem to only provide limited assistance for those with very specific, sufficiently official diagnoses? I have found that they often just give up in the face of any kind of serious mental illness. That's such a good point too. I definitely, because I don't work in a center for students with disabilities, I feel like some people here could probably say more about how students are looked at in that way. I definitely felt like I knew I crossed a line. Let's put it that way, kind of what you're saying, where I was no longer manageable if anyone found out. Suicidality was a huge part of that. I mean, it's one thing to, have depression or anxiety, but who's going to hire someone with suicidality? I mean, how attractive of a candidate is that when it's so competitive to get a job right now? So I felt that as someone in search of a job, certainly. In terms of, I have heard from my students that I am incredibly accommodating and understanding about disabilities, and even with students who are not with the Center for Students with Disabilities. So I don't know if that is kind of evidence of what you're talking about, and that I worry that we lose students after a certain point because they are not able to come to school, or they are not, able to attend class beyond what sort of a functioning, even barely functioning student can do. And so it's just attrition. And so we've lost them before we're even tracking this stuff. Yes, definitely. I found professors are often eager to help with these things, but I think that is often the only kind of effective assistance. Yeah, and I think our accommodation system, I'm not aware of exactly what accommodations I should be giving or not be giving. I'm not, and at either university that I teach it at. And I don't think across the country that we really talk about that and what does it mean? And yeah. Miles, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I didn't want to hog time if someone else said something. Well, Sarah, I've decided to speak to you, even though you wrote a book in 5 months. It's
okay. I spent 5 years on a novel that went into the garbage.
Yeah,
so I did my time.
Yeah, no, congratulations on this. Hey, I just want to ask you about the use of second person in that introduction, the you voice, who that is, what the choice behind that was, etc.
It's my mom. And so when we were walking around, she and my sister are the heroes of the book, and the psychiatrist. When I what changed for me was I finally went to the psychiatrist I see now, and I sat down in front of him, and he said, I'm going off topic, but we did our little 29-minute meeting, and I was in a very bad place. But anyway, I waited for him to sort of declare what diagnosis I had now, or would he agree with the other diagnoses. And so he just looked at me and he said, I don't know what you have. And like my brain exploded. And I just thought, no one knows what I have actually. And so then I started researching the DSM and getting into that. But he's a hero of the book. My sister very much is a hero of the book. And so is my mom. And so the you is my mom. She, I leave as a memoirist. I'm very comfortable telling my story. I'm not comfortable. I really draw a line at telling other people's stories. So my family really isn't in the book very much, in the sense that I don't talk about what my sister was going through at that time. I don't talk about what my mother was going. That's their lives, and that would be their books to write. But I do say how, I lived with my mother for 5 years. As I said, I couldn't live independently. And without that, I don't think I would have survived. But it was very, very, very hard on her. And so I wanted to be sure to acknowledge the families, and I wanted to be sure to have her at the front. And, to be honest, by the time, this started to kind of finally get a little bit better, I mean, it was very hard on her. I mean, she was really, I feel like I almost broke her, and that's a terrible thing to feel with a parent, but she's fine now. Everything's okay. So, but yeah, so, but you asked something else too, besides the you.
No, that was the big question. And is it sort of like a love letter to her
Yeah.
I mean, why did you make that choice?
I think because it was so hard on her, and my family did not want me to write this book. I told them about it, and they were very, very, very no. I mean, they said it will ruin your life. You will never get a job. Do not do this. Now they're psyched. Now everybody's on board. Now everybody can't stop telling their friends. But but at first it was not like that. And so, yeah, it was mostly just that it's interesting because until you said that, I didn't realize that the beginning is to my mother. And by the end, I'm talking about the elixir, and I'm not able to find an elixir. I can't give you an elixir at the end of the book. But it's really addressed to who I dedicate the book to, which is everyone who's been diagnosed and misdiagnosed and overdiagnosed. So it kind of turns. So you didn't allow me, I didn't notice it, but it's very, personal to start, and then it kind of widens by the end. So, yeah. Yeah, Kara.
How did you choose what to include or not include, as far as your experience living with mental illness, and were there any moments that you felt like you wanted to put in there but didn't, and how did you kind of make those decisions?
Like I said, I left a lot out, for instance, about my mother that I knew she wouldn't be comfortable with. The only person who I kind of expose, I guess, is an ex-boyfriend of mine, Ray, and he was the only person who saw any of the book while I was writing it. And he's a construction worker and works long hours, jackhammering, and just cannot even read anymore. But he listens to audiobooks. So I would finish a chapter and record it and send it to him. And he listened to every chapter, and that's how I wrote it. And all he would do, this is what you want from a writing partner, people, is all he would do is write back, it's fantastic, keep going. That's all you want to hear. Actually, we don't want any feedback. That's the cruel truth of creative writing. But so in terms of it was interesting because when I was in conversations with publishers when we were selling the book, one publisher asked, what evidence do I have a little bit? Which was really fascinating. Like, do you have journals? Where did you get all this from? How do you remember this? And so going back to Miles's point, I wonder if that was, I mean, we've had, memoirs come exposed as being fabricated. And Miles and I were on a panel about this at the Nonfiction Now conference, but that there's such a difference between lying and, making a mistake or misremembering or something along those lines. This is a much larger discussion, but I think that I did start to get medical records just to be sure. And I was wrong about some things. So that was partly, I did want to keep it in check. I had a lot of this thing called a life chart. I had the hospital records. So I had those things, and I had some journals. I'm not a huge journaler, but I had some journals. So I knew I had a kind of map to go by. But in terms of, I definitely put in and took out the suicidality several times because I didn't really want to admit to that. And now I have no trouble at not just admitting to it, but to try to, I think that suicidality is very much romanticized and dramatized, and it is a place no one should have to go. And yet on the other side, there are a lot of survivors, and we're all here. Like, we're here and we're a strong bunch. So welcome, anybody. Cool.
I think that was a very kind of powerful note to end on. And you're also a wizard, Sarah, because it is exactly 5:30. So
my alarm went off, actually.
So I will put out one final call for any lingering questions. Just wait a minute. And then maybe, you all will join me in a Zoom display of enthusiasm and gratitude for this wonderful project.
Thank you so much for coming. And I put my website up there in case you want to contact me, or you can contact me through DePaul, but also just in case you wanted to see anything about it and talk more.
All right. Thanks very much, all. Have a good night.
Thank you for having me so much, and for all coming out. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Bye, Dan. Thanks for the introduction.
Thanks.
Thanks, Megan, for organizing this, and Mark. Thank you.